What's up YouTube? Today I just wanted to do a brief video, assuming that with some difficulty I can keep it brief, about how a random comment on a random old video of mine inspired me to realize how I was both right and very wrong about some things I said all that time ago. Shall we dive into it? If you can possibly believe it, despite the rather extensive collection of brass equipment cluttering up this apartment, I do not own a single product from the HN White, King, or UMI musical companies. Just nothing. Zero. Not a single instrument, mouthpiece, mute, or any other musical accessory, somehow. But I have done a number of reviews on King Company instruments. A lot of them are dated and rather embarrassing looking back on them.
Well. What have we here? Looks like we brought out the big guns today. Thanks for tuning into this very special instrument demonstration.
A few years back, I did this review on the King Model 600 student model trumpet, very generic instrument as far as I'm concerned. I uploaded it in late 2019, but I would have had it recorded around early 2018 if I remember it correctly, so now about half a decade ago, which is another sobering reminder of the fact that I'm definitely not getting any younger as the years go by. In terms of raw view count, I guess you could say this was one of my more successful reviews, but it definitely was not as well received as some of my others on the channel, and that is pretty fitting. Not only were the playing demonstrations exceedingly mediocre in that video due to factors like my recent embouchure shift and a very small and tight mouthpiece being jammed into the receiver, but it just wasn't very well researched. I wasn't well prepared to do the video, and it wasn't sincere, I think is the biggest thing. I tried to keep it mostly positive, but internally I really did not like that horn. And that was a prejudice I carried with me for quite a number of years. I think the video description, probably one of my better ones, sums up my feelings nicely. The King 600 student model trumpet suffers from the usual symptoms of foggy low range, pinched nose high range, and general lack of resonance that plague most student model instruments. If that doesn't tell you, I don't know what will. Now, usually I try not to think too much about that video or others like it, rather I try and stuff them to the back of my brain and live them down as best as possible, but this one was brought to my attention fairly recently by a comment from my friend Carrie, whom I know from the Facebook trumpet playing sphere, and Carrie wanted to know whether this was a King Cleveland 600. Initially I didn't give the question much thought. I figured, King used to manufacture in Cleveland, Ohio, so it's probably a Cleveland model, right? And then I thought a little bit harder, and I realized that in my time servicing student and school-grade instruments at Clearwater Music, I'd worked on a lot of King instruments, and some of them said things like King 600 on the bell, and then others said King Cleveland 600. And that got me thinking. These are fairly similar looking horns, especially when you zoom out from the bell. I think the modern Eastlake, Ohio horns, like the one I reviewed, do look a little bit better than their older Cleveland counterparts, but I had this nagging suspicion that I couldn't talk about one pretending like it was the other until I really played both and could determine something a little bit more meaningful. Because there are trends with certain makers where their old student model stuff is really quite a bit better by a couple notches than their newer stuff. Little did I know that my chance would come approximately 48 hours later. My very next shift at Clearwater Music, I happened upon a true Cleveland 600 at the shop, and I took 2 minutes before my shift to just plug a mouthpiece in and play whatever came to mind. Here are a couple clips for your enjoyment. The results straight out of the gate were pretty frazzling. I mean, keep in mind this isn't a total one-to-one with the Eastlake that I reviewed all those years ago, just because presumably after half a decade my playing's in a little bit of a different state, and also I was using a much larger mouthpiece, a Schilke 20 to be exact, but nonetheless, I was really surprised. Of the things I complained about in my 600 review, chief among them was the sound of the instrument. I found the Eastlake 600 to be rather dull and lifeless and thin sounding unless I pushed it, but if I did push it, then it got strident and overbright and felt like it could shatter glass and my eardrums all at the same time. Not a good experience overall, didn't like it too much. But when I played the Cleveland 600, oh boy, it was a warm, rich, and buttery sound that I did not think King student trumpets were capable of. I was very surprised. Additionally, all of the high notes were present on the Cleveland, much unlike its Eastlake counterpart. That was definitely a nice touch. And overall, just the whole package had a much better vibe in the hands and on the face than the Eastlake that I reviewed all those years ago. This Cleveland 600 serial number was in the 600,000s, fittingly enough, which appears to make it from the late 1970s, was certainly older than the Eastlake that I reviewed. That one would have been from probably the early 2000s, nothing earlier than that, I suspect. But it's interesting to see how that sort of negative association between time and development of student model trumpets can go. My recent encounter with this fairly run-of-the-mill ugly duckling horn, many thanks to Carrie's comment, finally answered for me the question of why so many people speak so highly of the King 600 trumpet, when I, not for nothing, for a quarter of my life thus far, had carried with me such a negative association with it. It turns out we're talking about a slightly different horn. It's a good playing horn, and what's more is that it's, along with things like the Olds Ambassador, sort of what I would describe as the quintessential pawn shop trumpet. These things will turn up in friends' attics and basements, and they'll go, "Oh, this was Granddad's trumpet in grade school, and he hasn't played it in this and that many decades, but it's been sitting here ever since." And it'll turn up on thrift store walls for 50 to 100 bucks. I know a friend who got one from a pawn shop for about 70 bucks in very workable condition, and I'm sure it plays just as nicely as the one I played. But it was just really an eye-opening experience, pretty amazing. Now, before I let you go today, I'd like to pull up a little post from the Trumpet Herald forum from way back in 2005, where a user describes a King 600 that they got from the mid-50s, and with very much the same impressions as I had, which was that the sound was nice and warm, and the upper register was very well locked in. And then they also similarly describe an Eastlake 600 that they say was definitely a student model and something they wouldn't feel guilty giving to a little kid to beat up, unlike its Cleveland counterpart. That lines up, that all checks out. I think the word brief got tossed out the window some time ago, but nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the phenomenon of the King 600 and how one that was newer to me but older to history had some interesting ramifications. I've certainly enjoyed making this video, and I want to do more retrospective pieces like this to hopefully go back and remedy some of the things that I said in older videos that are rather poorly done, but unfortunately some of the most viewed on the channel. It definitely would help to clear the water a bit in some areas. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and a comment down below, and check to make sure that you are actually subscribed to the Samuel Plays Brass channel. Most of my usual viewers are not, and therefore are not staying up to date with my content. So hey, no pressure, but feel free to subscribe down below. Until next time, we've got new videos coming out every week, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the flip side.